April 12, 1945. Fort Reno, Oklahoma. The sun blazed down on the flat prairie landscape, turning the air thick and heavy with heat. Greta Hoffman stepped off the transport truck, her legs unsteady after days of travel across the Atlantic and then by rail through the American heartland. The dust kicked up by the vehicle's tires coated her throat, making each breath taste like chalk and defeat. She was 23 years old, a telegraph operator who had spent the last 3 years of her life transmitting coded messages for the Wehrmacht, her fingers dancing across keys while bombs fell around her station in Hamburg. Now those same fingers gripped the rough fabric of her gray uniform, stained with sweat and the grime of surrender. The barbed wire fence stretched before her like a promise of suffering. This was it, the end of everything. She had heard the stories, whispered between captured soldiers during the ocean crossing. American camps were brutal, starvation, disease, revenge for what had been done. Greta steeled herself, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in her stomach that had been her constant companion for the past 8 months. In Hamburg, rations had dwindled to almost nothing. A slice of black bread, watery soup with perhaps a potato if you were lucky. The taste of real meat had become a distant memory, something from another lifetime. She expected worse here. Much worse. The guard who approached her was young, maybe her age, with a sunburned face and an expression that seemed almost bored. He gestured for her and the 4 other women from her transport to follow him. They walked in silence, their boots crunching on the gravel path between rows of wooden barracks. The camp was enormous, far larger than Greta had imagined. Hundreds of buildings spread across the Oklahoma prairie. In the distance, she could hear voices, laughter even. That couldn't be right. Perhaps it was the guards mocking them. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Greta felt sweat trickling down her spine beneath her uniform. The air smelled different here. Cleaner somehow despite the dust. No smoke, no ash, no death, just the earthy scent of prairie grass and something else. Something that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. Food, the smell of cooking food. Her steps faltered. The guard noticed and turned back, his expression neutral. "Come on," he said in accented but clear German. "Mess hall, time to eat, eat." The word seemed impossible. Greta exchanged glances with Marguerite, a nurse who had been captured alongside her. Marguerite's hollow cheeks and sunken eyes reflected what Greta knew she must look like herself. They were walking skeletons in uniforms, held together by nothing but stubborn pride and the will to survive one more day. The mess hall loomed ahead, a long wooden structure with screens on the windows. The smell grew stronger with each step. Bacon. The unmistakable, intoxicating aroma of frying bacon. Greta's mouth flooded with saliva so suddenly she nearly choked. It had been over a year since she had tasted bacon. Real bacon, not the rancid fat they had been issued in the final months before Hamburg fell. The guard held open the door. Inside, the scene that greeted them defied every expectation. Every nightmare scenario Greta had constructed during the long journey across the ocean. The mess hall was bright, almost cheerfully so, with sunlight streaming through the screened windows. Long tables filled the space, and at them sat dozens of prisoners, both men and women, eating from metal trays. But it was what lay beyond them that made Greta stop dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. A serving line, a buffet. Steam rose from metal containers, and behind them stood American soldiers in white aprons, serving spoons in hand. And the food. Dear God, the food. Greta's vision seemed to narrow, focusing with laser intensity on the impossible abundance before her. Scrambled eggs, mounds of them, fluffy and yellow and glistening with butter. Bacon, strips and strips of it, crispy and dark. Sausages. Toast, white bread toast stacked high. Fresh milk in pitchers, the cream still floating on top. Butter, real butter in small pats. Jam in jars. Coffee, actual coffee, not the chicory substitute they had choked down in Germany. Her legs refused to move. This had to be a trick, some kind of cruel joke. They would let her see it, smell it, and then snatch it away. Or perhaps it was poisoned. Yes, that made more sense. They would feed the prisoners poisoned food and be done with it. Greta felt Marguerite's hand grip her arm. "Is this real?" Marguerite whispered, her voice cracking. "Is any of this real?" The other women in their group stood frozen as well, staring at the buffet like it was a mirage that might vanish if they blinked. Around them, other prisoners moved through the line with practiced ease, holding out their trays as servers piled food onto them. No one was stopping them. No one was measuring portions or slapping hands away. A man in front of them received 4 eggs, 6 strips of bacon, 3 pieces of toast. He moved down the line and someone added a ladle of beans. Another server offered him milk or coffee. He took both. The guard who had escorted them noticed their paralysis. He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "It's okay," he said in his careful German. "You can eat. Take what you want." Take what you want. The words made no sense. Greta had not taken what she wanted in 3 years. She had taken what she was given and been grateful when it was enough to keep her alive another day. Her hands trembled as she reached for a tray from the stack at the beginning of the line. The metal was cool and solid under her fingers. Real. This was real. She moved forward, her movements mechanical, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The first server, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, smiled at her. "How many eggs?" he asked in English. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He gestured at the eggs, then held up fingers. 1, 2, 3, how many?" Greta's throat was so tight she could barely speak. 1, she whispered in German. The server frowned slightly, then scooped 3 large spoonfuls of scrambled eggs onto her tray. Before she could protest, he had moved on to the next prisoner. 3 eggs. 3 entire eggs worth of scrambled, buttery perfection steaming on her tray. The smell made her dizzy. She shuffled forward. Bacon. The server held the tongs over the pan, waiting for her to indicate how much. She held up one finger, her hand shaking so badly she could barely control it. He placed 4 strips on her tray, the grease glistening, the edges crispy and perfect. She wanted to cry. She wanted to grab the tray and run before someone realized the mistake and took it all away. Toast, butter, a small container of jam, milk poured into a glass, white and cold and impossible. By the time she reached the end of the line, her tray was so full she was afraid she would drop it. The weight of it felt obscene, sinful. This much food all for her, all at once. She found a seat at one of the long tables, setting the tray down with exaggerated care. Marguerite sat beside her, her own tray equally laden. The nurse was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she stared at her food. Around them, other prisoners ate with varying degrees of emotion. Some attacked their meals with desperate hunger. Others ate slowly, savoring every bite. A few, like Marguerite, simply wept. Greta picked up her fork. Her hand was shaking so badly the utensil rattled against the metal tray. She scooped up a small portion of eggs, watching the steam rise from the fluffy yellow mass. The smell alone was enough to make her stomach cramp with longing. She brought the fork to her mouth. The eggs touched her tongue and the world stopped. Butter, real butter, rich and creamy. The eggs were soft, perfectly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper. The texture was like clouds, like something from a dream she had forgotten she ever had. The taste exploded across her palate, so intense after months of bland, insufficient rations that it was almost painful. Something broke inside her. The fork clattered to the tray as Greta buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She couldn't stop. The tears came from somewhere deep, some place she had locked away in order to survive. All around her, she was dimly aware of others crying too. The sound of weeping mixed with the clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. No one tried to stop them. No one told them to be quiet or to hurry up. The guards stood at their posts, their expressions carefully neutral, as if crying prisoners were the most normal thing in the world. Greta cried for the eggs. She cried for the bacon and the white bread and the real butter. She cried for the waste of it all, the sheer impossible abundance that surrounded her while back home, people were starving. She cried for the lie she had believed that they were fighting for something righteous, something necessary. She cried because she was eating better as a prisoner, as a defeated enemy, than she had eaten as a loyal soldier of the Reich. What did that mean? What did any of it mean? She had transmitted messages about glorious victories, while her own rations shrank to nothing. She had believed the propaganda about enemy brutality, while her own people starved. And now here she sat, in an enemy camp, surrounded by more food than she had seen in a year, being treated with a kindness that made her earlier beliefs crumble to ash. Marguerite's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight. "I know," the nurse whispered, "I know." Greta wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing tears and dust across her face. She picked up the fork again. She had to eat. She had to. Even if it meant accepting that everything she had fought for was a lie, even if it meant admitting that she had been wrong. The eggs were still warm. She took another bite, then another. Each mouthful was a small revelation, a tiny piece of truth that she had been denied. The bacon was crispy and salty and perfect. The toast, spread thick with butter and jam, was sweet and rich. The milk was cold and fresh, nothing like the thin, bluish liquid they had been given in Hamburg. She ate slowly, forcing herself to chew, to taste, to experience every bite. Around her, the mess hall continued its strange symphony of eating and crying and quiet conversation. A woman at the next table laughed at something her companion said, the sound startling in its normalcy. Two men argued good-naturedly over whether the coffee was better than what they remembered from before the war. A guard walked through, refilling water pitchers, his movements casual and unhurried. This was not a place of punishment. This was not revenge. This was something Greta had no framework to understand. When her tray was finally empty, scraped clean of every last bit of egg and bacon grease, Greta sat back and stared at her hands. These hands had served the Reich. These hands had transmitted orders that sent men to their deaths. These hands had believed they were doing something right, something necessary. And now these hands had been fed by the enemy with a generosity that shamed every belief she had ever held. The guard who had escorted them appeared at her shoulder. "You can go back for seconds if you want," he said in his careful German. "We have plenty." Seconds. The word was absurd, obscene, impossible. Greta shook her head, unable to speak. The guard nodded and moved on, leaving her to sit with the weight of her full stomach and her shattered worldview. That night, lying on a real cot with a real mattress and clean sheets, Greta stared at the ceiling of the barracks and tried to make sense of what had happened. The other women in her section were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The smell of the evening meal still lingered in the air. They had been fed again. Meat loaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, dessert even, a small square of cake with frosting. Cake in a prison camp. Marguerite's voice drifted through the darkness. I wrote letters, she said quietly, to soldiers at the front, telling them how proud we were, how they were heroes. I believed it. Several other voices murmured agreement. They had all believed it. They had all done their part, convinced they were on the right side of history. And now they were here, fed and clothed and treated with a basic human decency that their own government had failed to provide in the end. What do we do now? Someone asked. No one had an answer. The days that followed established a routine that felt surreal in its ordinariness. 3 meals a day, every day, each one abundant beyond reason. Breakfast with eggs and bacon and toast. Lunch with sandwiches and soup and fruit. Dinner with meat and vegetables and potatoes. Coffee whenever they wanted it. Milk, butter, sugar. Things that had become luxuries now given freely. Greta began to put on weight. Her uniform, which had hung loose on her frame, started to fit properly again. Her face filled out. Her hair, which had been dull and lifeless, began to shine. She was healing, physically at least. The emotional wounds were deeper. She watched the other prisoners, trying to understand how they were coping. Some threw themselves into the camp routine with enthusiasm, grateful for the respite from war. Others remained sullen and withdrawn, refusing to accept kindness from the enemy. A few, like Greta, seemed caught in between, unable to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught to expect. The camp had a library. Books in German, donated by American organizations. Greta found herself drawn there, reading newspapers and magazines that told a very different story than the one she had known. The accounts of concentration camps. The photographs of liberation. The testimonies of survivors. She read until her eyes burned, until the words blurred together, until she wanted to vomit from the horror of it. This was what she had served. This was what her messages had supported. The eggs and bacon took on a different meaning. They were not just food. They were a mirror, reflecting back the vast gulf between what she had believed and what was true. The Americans fed their prisoners well, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Out of a fundamental belief in human dignity that her own government had abandoned, if it had ever possessed it at all. One afternoon in late May, Greta stood in the mess hall line, her tray in hand, going through the now familiar ritual of being served more food than she needed. The server, the same kind-eyed man from her first day, smiled at her. "You look better," he said in his halting German. "Healthier." Greta nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He piled eggs onto her tray just as he had that first day. As she moved down the line, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The weight of the food, the weight of kindness, the weight of knowledge, the weight of shame. She sat at her usual table and picked up her fork. The eggs were perfect, as always, fluffy and buttery and warm. She took a bite, and this time she did not cry. This time she simply sat with the truth of it. She had been wrong. Everything she had believed, everything she had fought for, had been a lie. And the proof was right here, in the taste of scrambled eggs and bacon, in the fullness of her stomach, in the basic human decency of people she had been taught to hate. The war was over. Germany had lost. And Greta Hoffmann, telegraph operator, loyal soldier, true believer, had to figure out how to live with the knowledge that she had been on the wrong side all along. The eggs were delicious. That was the worst part. They were absolutely delicious. And every bite was a reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had wasted, everything she could never get back. But she ate them anyway, because she was alive, because she was here. Because there was nothing else to do but keep going, one bite at a time, one day at a time, trying to build something new from the ruins of everything she had once believed. The mess hall buzzed with conversation around her. Prisoners laughed and argued and made plans for after the war. Guards refilled coffee cups and cleared trays. The sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. And Greta Hoffman ate her eggs, tasting both salvation and damnation in every bite, knowing that this moment, this meal, this kindness from the enemy would haunt her for the rest of her life, because it had shown her the truth. And the truth was harder to swallow than any amount of humble pie could ever be. The truth was that she had been wrong, and the eggs, those perfect, fluffy, buttery eggs, would never let her forget it.